The biggest surprise of Nintendo's June 2024 Direct for me that I don't think anybody leaked was the announcement of Romancing Saga 2 Revenge of the Seven, and I was ecstatic when I saw it. The original Romancing Saga 2 released in Japan on the Super Famicom in 1993. It was an extraordinarily ambitious game for its time, trailblazing a completely new dynastic progression structure for the JRPG genre that hasn't been successfully replicated in any other JRPG I've played since. It was an extremely experimental game system where your main character, the Emperor of an Empire, would go through adventures until they died, either from players getting wiped by monsters, which was pretty common since the game could be quite difficult, or just from old age after enough game time passed from doing quests. And then a new character would inherit their strengths, continuing the cycle until the end of the game. The first few Emperors and the last one could be considered the main characters as their consistent stories between playthroughs. Every Emperor in between is determined by RNG availability and how player event progression has unlocked the other potential Emperors represented by their jobs. I went over this game a little bit in my Romancing Saga series video I've linked down below, but the idea was awesome and I enjoyed the game, just not as much as the other two Romancing Saga games. My biggest problems with my own enjoyment of the game were the serious user experience issues that just became even more apparent when compared to modern JRPGs and their excellent user experience features. Nonetheless, the original game is still a really fun, solid entry in the Romancing Saga series, and definitely one of the more accessible Saga games out there when compared to new entries in the series over the past few decades. So what are these user experience issues I'm referring to? Well, you can see one of the problems here in the remaster of the original game that got a Western release. The low frame rate of the original game made movement clunky to the point where the symbol encounters weren't much better than random encounters even in the remaster. The original Super Famicom version of Romancing Saga 1 shared this trait too, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they were earlier generation Super Famicom games that weren't optimized for the hardware. Another problem occurs between Emperor generations. The game requires you to recruit a new adventuring party when you wipe or many years pass to make way for a new Emperor. You can't just do everything through menus like you can in most games. You have to travel to the locations to recruit these people. This is, in my opinion, the worst issue, as it takes the most time away from the more fun parts of the game and significantly ruins the pacing of the gameplay experience. At the same time, Romancing Saga 2 is the most difficult Romancing Saga game, at least for me, so it's really easy if you aren't constantly saving or run into enemies instead of walk into them to suddenly wipe to some mobs when your formation is scuffed and the enemies get the first strike. The last one I can think of right off the top of my head is the research and development you do throughout the game. Again, you have to go to the actual locations in your castle area to develop spells, weapons, and armor. You also manage skills and formations by talking to people instead of only directly through a single status menu. But what would happen if this old classic game was remade to fix up its user experience issues, had significant graphics updates, and rebuilt its combat system to include popular features introduced in modern Saga games? Well, we were about to find out because Square Enix and Akitosho Kawazu have been cooking, and the announcement of Romancing Saga 2 Revenge of the Seven had me off my chair when it was revealed during the Direct. The perfect game to put right before the game everyone else was excited about in Nintendo's presentation, Metroid Prime 4. But before I go into some of the cool details I noticed in the remake trailer, I want to explain a bit about what makes Romancing Saga 2 so special as a JRPG. The Romancing Saga series was definitely when Kenji Ito's music started taking center stage in the games he worked on, and Romancing Saga 2 just continued this show with an amazing soundtrack. The story of Romancing Saga 2 is actually very simple, as the majority of the main story is told in the first few generations of the game, so it doesn't really spoil itself. Like most Saga games, the gameplay takes a much bigger focus than the story. Without going into too many details, your goal is to defeat 7 main bosses in the game. While they're not hidden, they're spread all over the game's world and doing their own things. In order to discover and defeat them, you'll have to fix a whole bunch of problems your Chancellor will notify you of. As you explore the world and talk to people, more locations open up too. While there are a few beginning story quests that introduce you to the style of gameplay, the game will quickly open up its world to a point where you can choose where to go and which quests to do first. A lot of the quests have multiple outcomes that determine which jobs you unlock or whether a region will become a part of your empire or not. Some quests will bring you closer to encountering one of the 7 bosses, while others will reward you in other ways. After finishing up the more important tasks in the game, a significant amount of time will pass and you'll continue the game as a new emperor and will need to recruit a fresh party. It's kind of like Mega Man, except instead of choosing a villain at the beginning of the game, you're choosing a region in the world to explore. The Romancing Saga series itself was a huge pioneer in nonlinear JRPG gameplay in the early 90s, and Romancing Saga 2 added just a little bit more structure and direction to the foundations made in Romancing Saga by giving players 7 targets to aim towards. The game's simple encounters would scale in difficulty difficulty with your party to guarantee your party was always getting stronger and maintain an exciting level of challenge even in the regular mob encounters. Players have the option of running or walking in the game. Running is obviously faster, but it has the drawback of ruining your formation if you run into an enemy symbol instead of walk into it. One great thing about every game in the Romancing Saga series is that you can save the games anywhere at any time, which was a huge innovation in the 90s, even if it's pretty much standard practice these days. Your party also automatically completely heals their hit points between battles, even if they fall to 0 hit points in a fight. Completing quests and taking regions into your empire would also increase your income per battle. This income is spent on researching increasingly powerful equipment and making improvements to your kingdom. In addition to improvements you can buy, it's also important for your parties to develop their skill levels in weapons and spells through regular use. You do not level up in the traditional JRPG way with experience points. Spell skill levels determine which spells can be researched in your kingdom. Weapon levels and job class determine how easy it will be to glimmer powerful weapon skills. Weapon skills, weapon skill levels, and spell skill levels can be inherited by future generations of classes, and the effective levels of inheritance depend largely on how naturally skilled a job class is at using a specific type of weapon or element of spell. New formations are discovered with recruiting new job classes, making your heir someone who knows a new formation, and speaking with the formation soldiers in your kingdom. So making sure your heirs represent a lot of different job classes is important too. In fact, inheritance is at the core of the game's systems, as your characters will constantly die and new generations of their job classes will inherit the skills the previous generation learned through gameplay. To properly die in Romancing Saga 2, your whole party has to get wiped in a single battle, or characters need to lose all their life points to get wiped from the game. If your emperor loses all of their life points, you immediately have to choose an heir to continue the game. Life points deplete when your hit points reach 0 and they're downed. Each subsequent attack on a downed character removes a life point too. Unlike most Saga games, life points cannot be replenished, and when they hit 0, a character is permanently dead and removed from the game. However, in the next generation, you can go back to the job class's recruitment location and hire a new person that inherits the skills of the character that died. Any playable character in the game after the beginning has the potential to take the reins as an emperor, and I think some hackers actually discovered you'd have to wipe over 300 characters to actually lose Romancing Saga 2 before you reach the final generation. The more common way to die is to simply complete the game's quests and let time do its course between generations. In the final generation of the game, you control the emperor or empress you chose at the very beginning of the game. It is game over if your main character hits 0 life points at this point, or your entire party falls in battle. That's why it's important to spark as many skills and learn as many spells and useful formations as you can before you reach the final generation to make things as easy as possible for yourself. Romancing Saga 2 was the first game in the Saga series in which specific formations were given names and had specific effects in battle. They're extremely important to your party's survival, to the point where if you run into enemies instead of walk into them, you'll probably die in a dangerous area. For example, certain positions and formations will draw more aggro than others, and some formations will give turn order bonuses to characters in certain positions within the formations. There are other powerful bonuses and perks too. That's Romancing Saga 2 as I know and experienced the game. Like a lot of the better Final Fantasy games, people love to do challenge runs of this game too. There are minimalist runs, solo runs, and other fun challenges. I personally did an easier naked challenge of this game, fighting the final boss with nobody in my party wearing armor at the end of the game when I streamed it. The original Romancing Saga 2 has a Japanese stage play, and there are translations for the script available online too. It's a special JRPG with dynastic features that have not been toyed with in other JRPG series ever, and the game is the best-selling game out of the trilogy in Japan, having sold over 1.5 million copies over there, which compared favorably with Japanese sales numbers for Final Fantasy IV at the time. This game, while mostly unheard of in the West since it never got localized in its heyday, was a huge deal in Japan. So now that I've gone over a lot of the unique characteristics of what makes Romancing Saga 2 so special, I want to talk about the awesome things I noticed in the game's remake trailer. First, the voice acting sounds amazing in both languages from what I heard watching the trailers in Japanese and English. Everything's in full 3D now with the minimap. I can tell you there definitely won't be any technical frame rate input lag when you're trying to run past enemies in this game. Looks like Imperial Inheritance is still going to be in the game, which is really what makes Romancing Saga 2 Romancing Saga 2. They showed a lot of snippets from the more memorable quests in the original game too. The designs of the 7 heroes look awesome in 3D. Rock Bouquet is still up to her usual charms. It does look like the game is keeping the weight of players' decisions and how events in the game can play out. Regions can still be brought into the Empire too, which I think I can safely assume will still result in getting more money per battle too. The biggest change to this game that I could see is definitely to the battle system. The timeline from Saga Scarlet Grace and Saga Emerald Beyond was brought into the game, along with overdrives and united attacks. These are definitely my favorite new additions to the modern Saga experience. It's unclear from the trailer alone exactly how these new mechanics are implemented into this game specifically, but they should enliven the battle experience a bit more compared to the very traditional way it was done in the original game. Overall, it doesn't look as overcomplicated as Saga Emerald Beyond, since weapon type, magic type, and formation seem to be the only considerable variables in the game's battle system, much like the original game. The spells look fantastic, and everyone's favorite glimmer system is freshly represented in battle. I love how the Romancing Saga 2 weapon skills look in 3D. Obviously, they aren't going to show boring stat menus in an announcement trailer, but they do show a formations menu that details formations are just like they were in the original game. I can't see if they streamlined the most important thing to me at least, and that's how you have to constantly travel to re-recruit party members after wipes or huge time leaps. This game doesn't seem to have a run and walk system like the original game, which is probably for the better, because I know a lot of people who quit this game after running into everything and getting slaughtered because they didn't understand it was ruining their formations and giving the enemies the first turn by default when they did that. Instead, it seems like you can attack with your weapon on the field to begin a battle. You probably will get ambushed and destroyed in much the same way if you don't attack an enemy first or they tag you from behind. And I couldn't really see if they kept the variables involved in glimmering either, obviously, because I'm no data miner and I don't have a copy of the game. The game looks and sounds freaking awesome. I think it will be a lot more accessible than most Saga games to a more casual Western JRPG enjoying audience who isn't as familiar with the Saga series. It's even a much simpler remake style from what Romancing Saga 1 got, with all its new game mechanics that ended up detracting the more casual JRPG audience from that game. And it should even be more accessible than the most recent Saga games that have taken the series in a different direction. Personally, for me, it isn't really the complexity of the recent Saga games that bothered me. Rather, my biggest issues with recent Saga games like Saga Scarlet Grace and Saga Emerald Beyond was the lack of more free non-linear exploration elements that these earlier games like the Romancing Saga series have. Saga Scarlet Grace and Saga Emerald Beyond nailed the battle systems so hard, which is why I still enjoy them, but you couldn't visit the locations in any order, and you couldn't just freely exit one world to visit another or stop things midway to complete other things like you could in Romancing Saga. There weren't a significant amount of treasure chests or Easter eggs to find, and aside from the main characters and main villains, there weren't any other really memorable characters in those games either. I miss being able to explore dungeons and towns and find interesting things in them. The recent Saga games just feel less open to me. Romancing Saga 2 Revenge of the Seven has the potential to impress and surprise a lot of new people with this remake if they fixed a lot of the user experience issues I referenced. While the game won't have the wow factor the original got with all its ahead of its time mechanics, the dynastic JRPG progression is still a fresh and unique mechanic even today. I personally can't say I've ever played another JRPG quite like Romancing Saga 2 ever in the past 30 years. I couldn't tell you which remakes I'm most excited for, the Dragon Quest Trilogy HD 2D remakes or this one, but one thing's for certain. I'm completely and totally expecting to see a modern Romancing Saga 3 remake done in this style at this point, and I'll be even more ecstatic when I see it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.